This is Locked On Sports Atlanta, and it's time for the Atlanta Football Party, only on Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Atlanta Football Party, your home for the best Atlanta Falcons football talk. It's local insight you can't get anywhere but right here at Locked On. I'm your host, Tenitra Batiste. Alongside me are Falcons analyst Jarvis Davis and Locked On Falcons host Aaron Freeman. Senior Falcons reporter Tori McElhaney will be back next week. And of course, our Atlanta Football Party is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So the Falcons decided on the offensive side of the ball that there was a guy that they wanted to keep for good. We'll talk about that. And according to multiple reports, something happened, but maybe didn't happen with 18. We'll talk about that as well. And a couple guys that the Falcons were actually hoping to get. One guy, can they afford him? Can they pay the cost to be the boss? The other guy, did they really miss out, and do they have a game plan for him? And of course, as we know, today is legal tampering officially opening. So the Falcons have already made some moves before that period started. We'll talk about that. But first, my guys, let's talk about a move that we kind of saw coming, we didn't see coming, all at the same damn time. The Falcons made the decision to release Grady Jarrett, according to his agent, Todd France, who confirmed that decision to Channel 2's Zach Klein earlier today. Jarvis, drafted in the 5th round, 10 years with the franchise, 2-time Pro Bowl selection, team captain, Walter Payton Man of the Year nominee, and of course, Atlanta's own. But the move is expected to save the team roughly $60 million against the salary cap. And we know at the end of the day, it is a business. But let me start by asking you and Aaron first. What was your first reaction when you heard that news today?
For me, I was like, okay, I understand, because, we've been talking about this, T.
We have.
As soon as I saw that number, I was like, man, that's going to be a hard number to pass up there. We talk about being up under the salary cap restraints that is Kirk Cousins' contract right now, that you still haven't quite figured that out just yet. So, for being then Grady coming off of, an injury, like major injury, wasn't necessarily himself fully last year, when he played. So I think that it just kind of puts you in the mindset of understanding the business aspect of it. From a fan standpoint, which is still there. I know people kind of adopt that from time to time. It's kind of sucks. It's going to be weird not seeing 97 out there and having this press conference and talking to the media and during training camp. So when you think about it from that aspect of it's almost kind of like it's the end of an era for me, specifically on this defensive side of football. And it's kind of like, I really have my eyes peeled on this defense. I really have my eyes really peeled on this draft coming up. Who's going to be that guy? Is Root going to be that guy to replace him? I know that's a dumb question right now, but it's going to have to be one that can be answered in 2025. I need to see something from him if you're going to cut a guy like Grady.
Yeah. How about you, Aaron? When you first heard that news this morning, maybe less than an hour ago, what was your reaction to hearing that the Grady Jarrett era in Atlanta is done?
Well, it was tough, T, because intellectually, I understood it was a possibility, right? Yeah. I did a spot on 92.9 The Game last night, basically saying it's possible that they could cut Grady Jarrett. But emotionally, I wasn't prepared at all to deal with it and expecting it to happen. And so for that to be the news that you cut, not wake up to, essentially, as you're drinking your coffee, trying to get alert for the blitz that is in the bonanza that's going to come this afternoon. So you're not fully awake at that point in time to try to process those emotions as you look at and being like, wow, they really did it. I can't believe that they actually did the thing that we thought was definitely a possibility. Been talking about it for several months of it being a possibility, but still every time we talked about it, it was like, but I don't think they're going to do that, because if they cut Grady Jarrett, that's not to say a disaster, but it's a tough blow from a PR standpoint that you're going to have to take. And as Jarvis is saying, now the question is, okay, if Grady Jarrett's out, who's coming in? Because if you're cutting Grady Jarrett and then you're just going to sort of twiddle your thumbs this week to improve the defense, it's like, what are we doing here? You know, like you're cutting one of the 5 best players on your defense. And, you know, again, if you're going to use that 16 million.
Can I add ever to that, Free? Like one of the best Falcon players to ever play on this defense.
Yes.
Yeah. I think that's fair.
And you know, you've as Jarvis said, you free up 16 million, you know, that's smart business. But it's like, you know, this is not money that you can stash away for a rainy day. This is money that you have to use right now to improve your roster. And it's just like, Amen. Okay, so who you're going to get? And so that's kind of the complex emotions that I'm dealing with so far this morning.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that's a perfect word for it. I think it's complex. It's complicated because on the one hand, like you said, intellectually, you think about, okay, well, we're hearing those rumors, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the show, that the Falcons are kind of throwing their hat in the ring for a Trey Hendrickson, who is looking to, or at least is asked to be traded from the Cincinnati Bengals. So you think about that piece and the fact that if the Falcons have anyone else on their radar during this free agency period, they're looking for ways to be able to be a suitor for those teams. That's the educational, that's the intellectual part. But the emotional part actually takes me back to 2 years ago when I am on air at 92.9 and I literally have to run into the program director's office and say, we got to break the show. Like, we got to break commercial. Grady's done for the season. And I can remember back to how difficult that conversation was to have on air. And then, of course, we had the conversation here over at Locked On. And I also think of one more thing. Jarvis and I were covering Grady a few years ago with some things he was doing for his charity, because we kind of know Mama Jarrett a little bit there. And so it was always more than just, oh, we're covering Grady today. It's like the whole package deal. You know, we're talking about someone who's iconic in the city, someone whose mom has kind of, you know, created her own little niche in the city as well. And that's the part that you're going to miss, because Grady made the sometimes unlovable Falcons lovable. Grady made things make sense a lot of the time with what the Falcons were doing when it didn't make sense to the rest of us, right? He always was that guy who came to the podium and kind of level set things. So yeah, I think you guys make a perfect point about sort of the mixed feelings that you have this morning, hearing that news. But again, pulling it back, JD, pulling it back, Free, when you guys look at it from that intellectual standpoint, was it the right decision?
Oh gosh,
early to tell, right?
I mean,
I'll give you that.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah, I look at it from this standpoint. I think that when you look at where they need to be this year, and specifically Terry Fontenot, like, he's going to have to work his magic when it comes to this salary cap. I know those people, you know, that he has, you know, salary cap specialists, they may or may not have gotten from them from New Orleans, right? Because you understand what's at stake this year in 2025. I said this, I said it before, and I keep saying it. This is a important year. This is a vital year for Terry Fontenot to get this roster prepared to be able to go into the playoffs, right? From a talent standpoint, he needs to build this up to be able to have a roster that's ready to go out there and compete for a playoff spot, because I don't think he can continue to go down this road and not be able to do that. So I feel like Grady Jarrett being released speeds up that process, right? Like, because, you know, I was immediately talking about, all right, now is Root going to be this dude, you know, or are you going to bring somebody in? Are you going to keep David Onyemata? You know, is that a possibility as well? So it's just so many moving parts right now that I say, yeah, from a financial standpoint, it makes sense. But the connection that Grady has, establishing himself as one of those guys for this organization, more so, I feel, than Julio Jones. That's just me. I've always felt like Grady has been more connected to this city than Julio. So not to put those guys up against each other, but I'm just saying, just like the gravity of what this release means, I think that you have to make sure you have a plan. Yeah. Like, okay, I cut him. All right, now here's my plan. Here's what I'm about to do once this legal tampering period opens up.
Yeah, and I think you have to, if I could just say this real quick, Free, I think you have to get ahead of that narrative, because that's going to be, those questions are already here, right? There's been fodder the entire weekend about this whole conversation that happened between Kirk Cousins and Arthur Blank. So every time you look up, the Falcons are right back to being in the news as it relates to Kirk Cousins and his contract, right? So now you've got this Grady Jarrett situation where everybody's going to be scratching their heads like, okay, we understand it from a numbers perspective, but what's the actual plan going forward in order for you to address still the need that you're going to have with Grady gone, and still the need you have pretty much across the entire defensive front?
Yeah, I think you can justify it from the standpoint of, because we know Grady is on the the back end of his career,
Sure.
and so you can look at it and say, getting the production that you're expecting out of Grady Jarrett this year from another player is not going to be some gargantuan task. This is not cutting Grady Jarrett, 5 years ago when he was at the peak of his powers. This is, you're catching Grady Jarrett, probably in potentially like the last productive year of his NFL career in terms of being a high-end starter. Because one of the expectations I had, even if you retain Grady Jarrett, was that you were going to make him more of a situational player to try to maximize what's left in the tank there. So it's not from a standpoint of they can't find solutions on the football field, but you still have to go out there and find those solutions on the football field, right? You know, if you're going to trust in Rukaroro and Brandon Dorlus and potentially David Onyemata, who this whole time I've been assuming was as good as gone. So to see Grady Jarrett get cut before, David Onyemata is part of that whole, surprise at this point in time.
Sure.
But it's like, even though you can sit there and say, yeah, we can find a guy that is probably going to, what Grady Jarrett's stat line is likely to be, 3 or 4 sacks, maybe 20, 30 pressures or something like that. You can find players that can give you that on the football field, but it's going to be difficult. You still got to go out there and do it. And it's going to be difficult to replace all the other things that Grady Jarrett is going to do. Be that leader in that defensive line room, be that standard that sets and the tone setter for your defense, and for everybody who comes into this building looks at the way that Grady Jarrett is working on a daily basis, the way that he carries himself. All those things are now gone. And who's that player? Is it Jesse Bates? Is it AJ Terrell? Is it David Onyemata? Is it Caden Ellis? Who is that guy now that's going to be that standard setter for your defense? And those are some of these sort of intangible elements that you're going to lose from cutting a Grady Jarrett.
Yeah, and like you said, I think that is another name that we just thought it was a foregone conclusion that it would be David Onyemata first if we're talking about who's parting ways from that line. But hey, I think that'll be interesting to see as well what that news is going to be about David Onyemata, right? And how quickly are we going to find out what the status is or what they're going to do with him. But another thing that we thought about as we wrap up, just talking about Grady, is when you look at the replacement piece, right? You look at the draft, you look at free agency, you look at how they're going to replace Grady. Who are they going to bring in? And again, I know this is really sudden for us, so we may continue to evolve the answer to that question. But yeah, Jarvis, I mean, where do you go? Who is that guy out there that the Falcons can decide, hey, we can plug him in and he can be at a minimum as effective as Grady Jarrett? But if you're going to release Grady Jarrett, wouldn't you be looking for just a little bit more than what you got out of him, whether it is from the draft or free agency?
To be honest with you, my first thought is to look in there. Zach Harrison, right? They after him a beef up a little bit so he can pop down inside. So I feel like he can be, but it's going to be a combination of guys. Unless they go out and go get a big name guy, or did they draft a defensive tackle in the first round that they feel can be a guy that can come in and immediate impact on defense. Those IID guys that I've been talking about. So I feel like you have some options, right? Of course, you want to look in-house. I feel like Zach has earned a little bit more snaps, right? So if you're going to continue to have him play inside, at 280, 290, that's a nice size, with his length and the size and length you have right there. I think that, which the Falcons covet and love, so for him to be lining up inside, I feel like that might be the move for him to kind of go in as the guy kind of penciled in as the starter, if they keep David Onyemata, you might be working with something there, but it's going to be a process, and I don't think it's just going to be just one guy. So I feel like it's going to be a combination of in-house, and then potentially if there's a guy that falls to them at that 15 spot that they really like and they hold on to that second round pick as well, I think there are going to be some guys they might absolutely may take a chance on.
Yeah, I think this pushes up defensive tackle as a potential target in round one.
Sure.
It seemed like, at least, we'll see how it plays out over the next month or so, but it kind of feels like to me like the value is going to be a little bit stronger at that interior spot in terms of adding a pass rusher in round one than maybe at the edge rusher spot. So I could definitely see the Falcons looking to find the next Grady Jarrett with their number one selection in this year's draft.
Yeah, I think this is one of those that kind of makes us shift a little bit. And of course, we'll be talking about this one throughout the week because we, just like the fans, are kind of trying to wrap our heads around the fact that the Grady Jarrett era for the Falcons looks like it is done. Now, the Falcons did get a jump on the legal tampering period with another veteran we'll discuss when we take it under further review. This episode of our Atlanta Football Party is brought to you by FanDuel. March Madness is here, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to get in on the action like never before. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 extra bucks to use on everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories and even who's cutting down the nets. Now, I've got my eye on a few underdogs this year. And you know what? FanDuel can make it easy to back them with spreads, totals, and game props. And with tournament games happening almost every day, there's always something exciting to bet on. And the FanDuel app is still simply easy to use. When you win, you get paid instantly, no waiting around. So visit FanDuel.com and get in on the college hoops action all tournament long. So, Aaron, multiple outlets reported late Sunday a move that the Falcons made, which was to agree to a 2-year contract extension with Jake Matthews. The deal is worth $45 million and includes $38 million in guaranteed money. So what does this say, first of all, to you about how the Falcons still view Jake Matthews and what he brings to the offensive line?
Well, yeah, I think a lot of people looked at, does Jake Matthews have diminished value because they're moving to a left-handed quarterback, and Jake is no longer responsible for protecting the blind side of that left-handed quarterback. That's now the responsibility of the right tackle, Caleb McGarry. And so I think a lot of people were thinking, what's Jake supposed to do now? And I think this move kind of tells you that, no, you still need a good left tackle, right? That whole, blind side, front side protector sort of thing is probably a little overrated because you need 2 good tackles in today's NFL, because the TJ Watts exists and the Nick Bosa's exist and the Micah Parsons exist, and they move around the formation, or they line up on one side versus the other. So it's one of those things where I think this move signals that the Falcons are, still see Jake Matthews as having plenty of football left in the tank, and a player that's still valuable. He was owed like $31 million over the last 2 years of his contract before this extension. The reports are saying that that's now bumped up to $38 million, and that's now guaranteed at this point in time. And now I think his average per year is now making him like the 5th highest paid left tackle in the league at this point in time. So it's basically the team's telling us that, hey, we still value Jake Matthews. We still think he has a lot of good football left in him. And it's a very welcome, pay bump for Jake Matthews at this stage in his career where, there is a little bit uncertainty about what his long-term future is and how many more years he's going to play. This now sort of gives you a lot more certainty, at least for the next 2 seasons.
Yeah, at least for the next 2. How about you, Jarvis, when you heard that news late last night that Jake Matthews was given that 2-year contract extension? Would that kind of tell you about the Falcons' thoughts on him and his future and his importance to the offensive line for this team?
It just tells me that, hey, the Falcons value consistency and continuity up front on the offensive line, right? And especially when there's a possibility that you may lose Drew Dahlman. You
Yes.
can't be in a situation where you have to replace 2 starters on that offensive line that is protecting your quarterback, who has came in under some interesting situations, and now he has going to be his first season as the full starter for the Atlanta Falcons. So I think that there is some. It makes a lot of sense for me, for them to go to a guy like Jake and say, "Hey, man, we know we don't have any guaranteed money on your contract right now. So here's what we want to do. We want to make sure you're at least here until you're 35." And this dude has been just an absolute straight up Iron Man. Like he's been Cal Ripken for the Atlanta Falcons, right?
Yeah.
So if you want to put it in that perspective, so
sure,
I think this is something that it makes all the sense in the world. Continuity, consistency. That's been Jake. I'm not saying Jake is a Hall of Famer, but he has been consistent as all get out. You're not sitting over here worried about the left tackle being beat every week like you might be doing for the guy on the right side of the offensive line.
Yeah. Yeah. So that kind of made me think about that as well. Like, okay, nice that we're shoring up the left side of the line, but now you got Michael Penix Jr. under center. Kind of what we're doing on that right side of that line at that same space.
And let me just say this too, T.
Think about it. Yeah.
So I've been hearing a lot of people bring that point up and kind of hinted at it as well. Like, just think about from what this team is in most of the time. They're in pistol. They're in the gun. His feet are right parallel to the line of scrimmage. So he got his eye on the, he has an eye on the rush, most of the time now, because he's not up under center and he has his back to that left side. So to the right side. So for me, I don't feel like that whole blind side, front side stuff doesn't really matter at that time, because the quarterback is square at the line of scrimmage. A lot of times he's backing up and he has his eyes on everything, and is versus having his back to the defense on that particular side. So yeah, I think it's it matters. Don't get me wrong, but I feel like it doesn't matter as much as it did 15 years ago.
Okay. So before, and I don't want to get too far off the beaten path of Jake Matthews, but I guess my other question and follow up to that about Caleb McGarry would be, okay, so what you saw in those couple games that we saw Michael Penix Jr. out there, you're comfortable and confident that he's going to be okay in passing situations this upcoming season as it relates to his right side?
In 2025, yes.
Okay.
I have to be.
Oh, okay. Okay.
You can't create another hole. You can't create another.
You're never comfortable with Caleb McGarry. It's just like it's just one of those things where it's like every week it's going to be a talk. Well, Caleb McGarry is going to have to block Brian Burns. Caleb McGarry is going to have to block Max Crosby. Caleb, and you never feel comfortable with any of it. But sometimes he does a good, like in that against the Giants. Like Brian Burns did not take over that game like we thought he had the potential to do. And so like that's the thing with Caleb McGarry. It's you're never comfortable. He'll have some good games and you'll be like, oh, Caleb McGarry played well this week. And then there'll be a game like the season finale against the Panthers where you're like, Jadeveon Clowney hasn't done anything with the Panthers, and all of a sudden he's wrecking the offense. And that's also part of the Caleb McGarry experience, where it's just like you will never be comfortable with Caleb McGarry, but for the most part, he'll do his job. But at the same time, there's going to be a handful of games every single year where like, Caleb, what are we doing here, my guy? what is happening? So that's just the Caleb McGarry experience. So to answer your question, T, you're not comfortable, but at the same time, like it'll probably be fine.
Yeah. And you just have to hope in this upcoming season that it's not in more of the critical games that in some way, shape, or form cost you the postseason. Not that one player cost you the postseason, but I'm just saying you hope that in those situations that he shows us good Caleb versus not so good Caleb. But there's one more question I wanted to ask you guys. This is just out of curiosity. So we get the news last night that Jake is being extended. We get the news this morning that Grady's being released. So for you guys, why do you think the Falcons made that call to extend Jake but release Grady?
For me, I think it goes to a point that Jarvis said. It's about continuity. On offense, I think the goal is we're going to run it back with the same 11, 12 guys. That's the goal, right? Minus Kirk Cousins, right? On defense, because the defense struggled so much, it's kind of the idea of like, well, we're going to blow this thing up anyway, so might as well, let's really blow this thing up. So I think that's kind of what it boils down to.
Yeah, and I think and then from a salary cap standpoint, you kind of find where you can afford to blow it up, right? So, like you said, the defense struggle, like Free said, and then you have some guys that you put a lot of little investment into. Like I said, I keep bringing it up. Ruka Rororo. You traded up for this man too. So you're like, this dude has to play. You can't block these young guys because last year, that was an awful look that you can get any contributions from your 2024 draft outside of Michael Penix. Yeah. So that's not normal. We shouldn't get used to stuff like that. If rookie classes come in and make a difference, like multiple guys should be, at least two of your guys out of that draft class should be coming in and contributing, and that just did not happen for the Atlanta Falcons. So I feel, them going with the offensive line. So okay, I know we may be a little long in the tooth over here on this side, but hey, this guy has been consistent. He's been here. He hasn't missed any games. And we need to keep that we need to protect our biggest investment right now, which is our young quarterback, because he's the guy that's going to save all our jobs, right? If everything works out how we think it is. So yeah, it makes all the sense in the world. Like follow the assets and follow that money. The asset is over there at number 9. So if number 9 is going to be okay, yeah, we might be good. We got a chance.
Well, and I think that makes a great point, because that's really, you threw all of your hopes, dreams, and aspirations on him, even last season, if we're being honest, because Falcons went out and got Kirk Cousins. Within the month later, they turned around and drafted Michael Penix. So you're literally telling us that, hey, we believe the franchise is at hand with Michael Penix Jr. So yes, we need to then, when we have these opportunities or we have to make these tough calls, it literally has to come back to, but what are we doing with him? And you look across the league and you see everything from veteran linemen for the Chiefs, obviously not Tooney, but veteran linemen for the Chiefs that they just re-signed. And you look at the Bears, and the reason that the Chiefs don't have Tooney is because the Bears are like, no more. We're done with all of this, ransacking and ramshacking of Caleb Williams. So we know that offensive line is important. And one more thing, when you look at the performance of the Philadelphia Eagles, this particular Super Bowl, and even the one that they lost a couple of years ago, but the offensive line really did dominate in the trenches. They literally were like, we dare you. We dare you to come for Jalen Hurts. And that makes all the sense in the world that if you got a guy like Michael Penix, you absolutely have to protect what I believe will be the franchise. Now, a recent powwow, speaking of the franchise, the recent powwow indicated maybe where we're going from a legal separation to a divorce sooner rather than later. We'll talk about it when we run it back. This episode of our Atlanta Football Party is brought to you by FanDuel. March Madness is here, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to get in on the action like never before. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 extra bucks to use on everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories, and even who's cutting down the net. So if you got your eye on a few underdogs this year, FanDuel makes it easy to back them with spreads, totals, and game props. And with tournament games happening almost every day, there is always something exciting to bet on. And the FanDuel app is simple to use. And when I win and you win, you get paid instantly. No waiting around. So visit FanDuel.com and get in on the college hoops action all tournament long. That's FanDuel.com. So we have a little situation here, or not, maybe, Aaron, we'll see. According to multiple reports, Kirk Cousins met with Arthur Blank last week, and the team doesn't intend to release him. According to Sports Illustrated's Albert Breer, Cousins told Blank, quote, he wants to go to a place where he can start in 2025. Now, the Falcons brass, they have maintained from the start that they would do what's best for the team at quarterback. But does this meeting at all tell you anything about if the needle has moved for the Falcons, Cousins divorce to be final?
T, I don't know.
I feel the same way, Aaron.
I'm very eager to see how the Falcons handle the situation, because all the reports since the combine have been, no, the Falcons really are planning on keeping Kirk Cousins, and it is just baffling to me that like that's the plan. And like all the things they were saying during the combine when Terry Fontenot, Raheem Morris were doing their media tour was a lot of if statements when it came to Kirk Cousins' future in Atlanta that made it seem like to me that like they know he's not going to be here, but you know, they keep saying he's going to be here. And we thought the whole time it's because they're trying to drum up trade interest. And we learned, you know, the other night that apparently there's been no trade interest, which is not a surprise. Why would any team at this point really engage the Falcons seriously in the trade talk? If you're going to trade for Kirk Cousins, you just wait till after March 17th or whatever to see if that's the situation. Mm-hmm. So then you have the reports coming out that are like, oh, well, the Falcons are doing this, talking about keeping Kirk as a way to force Kirk to change his contract in order to make him more tradable or to lead to his release or whatever. And so I just sit here. I'm just kind of in wait and see mode. I'm just like, let's see, you know, how these guys handle it. You know, we got to let Terry cook, as they once said. And so, you know, I'm very eager to see what this meal tastes like once, you know, Terry's, you know, served it up for us, whether that's a week from today or, you know, several months from today. So I don't know what's going on with this whole Kirk Cousins stuff. And I'm just, all right, let's see how it all plays out.
Well, you know, being from New Orleans, I would say this whole thing feels like cooking gumbo. But, you know, Jarvis, I look at, and let me tell you guys, last night I read article after article after article because I was trying to find something in the tea leaves that said this meeting was going to give us an indication of where we were, like who's ahead in the chess match, because all of this offseason has been a straight up chess match. And I feel like I walked away like, so we still at the table negotiating the legal separation into the divorce. We still haven't decided. And again, this is in legal separation divorce terms. We still haven't decided who gets the property on the vineyard and who gets the property at home and who gets the property abroad. I mean, that's really all it felt like to me.
See, Kirk gonna need to stop snitching. Just stop talking, man. Like here's the thing. You know what could help you become a starter in 2025? Waive that no trade clause, boss. I promise you, everything gonna be okay. And be honest with you, if you waive the no trade clause, maybe the Falcons will be pay a little bit more of that bread. You know what I'm saying? You get some from, you know what I'm saying? Like, come on, and then you gonna get the rest from your new team. You know, as a part of that deal, because you know, guess what? You got to give a little something if you want to get what you want now. You know, and the one thing that was not only where they were talking about ifs and ifs and fifths and all that can be drunk. You know, like Free mentioned, they also said, we're going to do what's in the best interest of the Atlanta Falcons.
Yes.
Kind of take a shot every time you heard that during those press conferences, which is specifically Terry Fontenot. So I feel this is one of those things where Kirk feels like he believes them. I feel like Kirk believes that the Falcons are willing to have him as a backup. I feel like he wholeheartedly believes that because there's no other reason for you to go to Arthur Blank and have that conversation with him, right? And then go holler at old boy too. You know, I ain't gonna go get into that. You know what I'm saying? We're gonna keep that, you know, funky. Everybody on this show know exactly what I'm talking about. And if y'all don't know, y'all need to watch the show a little bit more. Right. Right. So it's very interesting timing. So I feel this is one of those situations where Kirk understands that the Falcons are willing to do it. It's a sunk cost at this point. That little $10 million. Hey man, all right, cool, whatever. What's $10 more million to 90?
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like, so hey, if you want to be a starter, what are you willing to do to get there?
Yeah. And the thing about it is, I think Aaron makes a great point as well. And I'm thinking back to like another deal that was reported this past weekend, or really yesterday, and that is the deal for DK Metcalf to go from the Seahawks to the Steelers. Steelers waited about 3 or 4 days. At the beginning of that conversation, the Seahawks were demanding a first and a third. Steelers sat for a couple days, Seahawks realized two things. Number one, they can go get a receiver wherever they want as a veteran. And number two, this is a deep draft class for receivers as well. All of a sudden, DK Metcalf goes to the Steelers for a second-round pick and swaps in the 6th and 7th rounds. So I'm looking at this like, Kirk Cousins, what Free said. There are not a lot of suitors out there for you. So I do think despite the money, the Falcons are still pretty much in control of this situation, obviously with the exception of that trade clause, but what the market is bearing in the lack of interest might also be the ultimate dictator of how this whole thing plays out.
Yeah, we'll see.
We shall see. Now, another thing that was interesting, and this is kind of still a work in progress, so I know we're all kind of looking at our notifications to make sure we don't miss it, and that is Trey Hendrickson, who requested a trade from the Bengals a couple years in a row and finally got his wish this year. So reports are that the Falcons are taking a stab at landing the league leader in sacks, 17.5. I mean, heck, that's more than half of what the Falcons got last season as an entire team. But can Terry Fontenot, so Free, I'll ask you, can Fontenot cook with a player he's familiar with from his days in New Orleans, despite the fact that, hey, the price might be too steep because that's an $18.7 million cap hit, the possibility of needing a new extension north $30 million at the end of the season if you get him. And then you might have to think about where you lose draft picks as well. I mean, is this something that you think the Falcons will legitimately pursue in getting Trey Hendrickson, or is the price just too steep?
Well, I don't think it's a money thing, especially now in lieu of the Grady Jarrett release.
Fair.
I think, money is it's, the Falcons are worth $10 billion. So like money is never an issue when it comes to professional football teams, unless you're the Cincinnati Bengals or something like that. So it's not really a price point. You can always find money somewhere under a rock in the NFL. The issue I think the Falcons are going to deal with when it comes to acquiring Trey Hendrickson is their lack of draft capital. That the Bengals probably want a day 2 pick. Ideally, I've seen multiple reports that say they ideally would like a late 2, but they'll probably accept an early 3. Well, the Falcons have a 2. They don't have a 3. So if the Falcons are going to trade for Trey Hendrickson, they're probably going to have to give up their 2nd-round pick.
Yeah.
And that will leave them with 4 picks. That will leave them with 1 pick in the top 100 in the 1st round. And then they won't pick again to I think 117 or something like that in the 4th round.
Yep.
And when you're a team that has so many holes on defense, and we'll see, maybe this time next week, they've filled some of those holes on defense and we're having a very different conversation. But when you have as many holes as this team has on defense, you might lose your starting center. All these things are in flux as we sit here today. This offseason, you need as many picks as you can get. And to give away one of the 2 good picks that you have for a Trey Hendrickson is going to be a tough pill to swallow, even though you're going to get a really good football player on the football field. But Trey Hendrickson is at roughly the same age as Grady Jarrett. So it's one of those things, and the Falcons found this out the hard way with Matthew Judon. He's approaching that age where most pass rushers, with few exceptions, tend to fall off at that point in time. And so even if you do acquire Trey Hendrickson, you're looking at it probably like a 2-year rental at best. And that 2nd-round pick or whatever you wind up giving up for him, theoretically, we know that hasn't been the case so far with the Terry Fontenot draft, but at least in theory, that's a guy that you're hoping can be here for 5 to 7 years. So you're kind of trading the long-term future of the team for the short-term game of acquiring Trey Hendrickson. And as we've discussed many times on this show, including today, given the pressure that's on this regime to win right now, you can understand why they would make that trade-off. But at the same time, we might be sitting here a year or 2 from now, similar to what we're talking about with the Matthew Judon trade, and being that didn't quite work out the way that the Falcons thought it would short term. And so therefore you hurt yourself long term. So it could be a lose-lose in addition to a win-win.
Yeah, but my thought was earlier too, when I saw the Grady Jarrett cut, my first thought was, okay, trying to put themselves in position to get a Trey Hendrickson. And who knows? I mean, there may be some magic, Jarvis, that Terry Fontenot can work from knowing him from his days in New Orleans. Obviously, he wasn't that Trey Hendrickson back then. But the thing is, his productivity has either risen or been consistent. And that's the one thing that Matthew Judon, you still kind of looked and said, well, there's still a little question there as it relates to injuries and production. You don't have that question with Hendrickson. So if you need to win now because your job is on the line, it might not be a bad deal to kind of take a chance on anybody. If you were going to take a chance, it might be Trey. Maybe. I don't know. What do you think, Jarvis?
A wise man out west once said, blank them doggone picks. Because here's the thing. My
You
draft
don't know.
you don't know.
Yeah.
You don't know when it's going to end. I don't know how informed Grady was as far as him being released, but it seems like Todd France may have had a little, and now I look back into his comments at the combine, I was like, oh, maybe he knows something that we don't know, but you don't know when this thing is going to end. And I think that goes for coaches, general managers, everybody, because he can't think 2 to 3 years down the road because he's been so focused in on unless it was a game-changing type player on offense, everybody else being, well, we're going to come in and bring them in. We have a plan for them. They're going to do this. And I was like, hey, man, I need somebody to come in here and play right now and have an impact. That's what you draft people for, and specifically on the defensive side of the football. So I feel like whatever magic or pixie dust you can sprinkle on this doggone thing when you make that phone call up to Cincinnati, man, you make it. You see if you can make it, get it done. Because, like you said, Trey Hendrickson, 30 years old. I get it. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I get it. I understand. I get it. But they ain't got nobody like him right now on this roster. Nowhere near. The dude had 17 and a half sacks last year. And he's not coming off injury like Matthew.
In 2 years in a row.
Right. You know what I'm saying? So he's talking about a runner-up for the Defensive Player of the Year in 24. So this is what he's coming off of. So you would assume that if this dude comes in right now, let's just say they get him, they bring him in, and it's 2025. This dude give you 15 sacks. And you draft a guy in the first round too as well, a young pup, bring him in. Then you got Arnie Ebiketie. You got all those guys. You got a group of guys that can, put some pressure on the quarterback. Then you working with something. You cooking a little bit. You give Ulbrich a few options as to what he can do when it comes to third and long. So yeah, I understand the trepidation free, but man, dog, like we ain't had nothing like this. And they need this. They need multiple guys that can potentially. They got a guy that can potentially do it for you for the next couple of years, and they got a guy that can potentially do it for you for the next at least the next 5 years with that fifth-year option in the first round.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And yeah, I think about and the hope free is that instead of him being more like Matthew Judon, he's more like a Jesse Bates III or Caden Ellis in terms of being able to, acquire a guy who could be that game changer that him to be, as opposed to, what you hope him to be. But we shall see. And I think too, just before we wrap up, when you make bold moves like letting Grady Jarrett go, you better be in process, whether that's free agency or the draft, but more so free agency. You better be in process of making a move. And it doesn't have to be like 1-for-1 as far as position goes, but you better be making a move that's going to change the trajectory of this defense if you decide to part ways with a guy like Grady Jarrett. So, and another top tier, that veteran was available. We talked about whether or not the Falcons were willing to pay for the cost to be the boss with him. But there was another veteran, albeit him young, that they were hoping to get, couldn't get. So where do they go from here? We'll talk about that on the other side. So Jarvis, we've talked a little bit about this player on various Atlanta Football Party shows the last couple of weeks, but found out that a guy that reportedly the Falcons had their sights set on, Jamien Sherwood, he agreed to a 3-year deal to stay with the Jets. So again, that's news we got late last night. And we've been talking about that linebacker core, right? Like, what are you going to do to improve that lackluster group? So with a guy like Sherwood now off the books, where should the Falcons go from here to shore up that linebacker core? I mean, do they do it in free agency, or would you rather the Falcons go into the draft to improve at linebacker? Where do you think, now that he's no longer an option, they should be going?
They're going to have to identify guys who are on the up brand, right? Because Sherwood just got his, hey, we know you're on the up and up, and we're expecting you to continue to play that level, if not better, right? At 15 mil per, I think it was, right? So when you think about it from that aspect, they're gonna have to identify another Caden Ellis, right? Because nobody really saw him coming in like that, especially, obviously now Terry Fontenot had a little inside information, right? He understands what Caden was going to be able to bring to the table. So he's going to have to make another Caden Ellis type signing, under the radar, not top of the free agent market type guy. He's going to have to really do his homework, and being a pro scout. Hey, that's your wheelhouse, dog. We ain't asked you to do anything that you ain't never done before. So I feel they're going to have to replace him in free agency with a guy that hasn't really hit just yet. But you feel like Ulbrich can squeeze some of that good production to make that contract look like, hey man, he was purely undervalued when he came out, when he was coming out in the free agent, and the Falcons got a deal, i.e. Darnell Mooney.
And Jarvis is absolutely right. When you look at the various rankings for the top free agent linebackers, Jamien Sherwood was just kind of in the middle behind Bobby Wagner, Dre Greenlaw, Ernest Jones, Nick Bolton, who we know just got paid. But ultimately, I think you might have to look for sort of that diamond in the rough, like a Caden Ellis, or in the case of the Eagles, a Zach Bond, that somebody sees something that person can bring to the table, meaning Terry Fontenot, somebody in your front office sees something that the person can bring to the table, but that doesn't break the bank for you because you have so many other needs.
Yeah. I think with Sherwood in the season he was coming off of, he was a guy that he was a lot more justified to pay the premium, as you saw the Jets do, to sort of keep him as sort of the guy in the middle of their defense. And so I think with the Falcons, you're probably not gonna, you're as Jarvis is saying, you're probably gonna look for someone who's maybe a little bit more of a bargain in free agency if you go that route. But the other path is to find that answer in the draft. Now, we know the Falcons so far with their linebacker picks under Terry Fontenot, they haven't gotten the production out of that position that they want with Troy Anderson and J.D. Bertrand. But that is another opportunity to get younger and more athletic on the defensive side of the ball. We know that's, the specialty of Jeff Ulbrich, the new passing game defensive coordinator, Mike Rutenberg and whatnot, of taking these young athletic linebackers that bring a lot of speed, and athleticism to the position and developing. You saw that with Mike Rutenberg being the linebackers coach with the New York Jets. We saw Jeff Ulbrich do that for many years with Deion Jones and Foye Oluokun and Devondre Campbell here in Atlanta. So I think the draft is also a path for the Falcons. But, again, with the limited draft picks that they have in this hypothetical world where the Falcons also trade for Trey Hendrickson, that becomes a much narrow bullseye for the Falcons to hit if they wind up losing more draft picks between now and the draft. So I do think you do give yourself in the value of signing that free agent is you're getting more of a known commodity. You're not as worried about, well, what happens if this guy doesn't develop in the ways in similar ways as Troy Anderson or Bertrand or even Nate Landman at that point. So I think there's value to the Falcons sort of nipping that position in the bud in free agency, and who that guy is at this point. Like, there was an obvious connection to Sherwood, and now it's just kind of, it opens the door for many different possibilities. Do you go after another high-end market guy like a Dre Greenlaw for the 49ers, or do you try to bet on a sort of a young up-and-comer, that Jack Sanborn guy from the Bears or somebody like that? So there's a lot of different paths I think the Falcons can address this linebacker position.
Yeah, and you speak of one linebacker that they may or may not, they released him according to multiple reports, but they may or may not bring him back just at a lesser tag. Or does it mean that the Falcons are moving on from that particular linebacker? We'll talk about that on the other side. So Jarvis, I'll start with you because I know that Landman was a guy that you really were cheering for. You were kind of advocating for him for a while now, but we hear that the Falcons will not be tendering Nate Landman nor Dee Alford. Dee, of course, finished third on the team with 83 tackles last year. Landman had 16 run stops, fourth highest total on the team. But let's start with Landman because that's where we ended the last segment. And should that be the case, that Landman will not be tendered as a restricted free agent, is that the right decision for the Falcons?
Yeah, I mean, I think given where you are in today's game and given what we saw from Nate Landman once he came off of that injury, I just don't see him being a starting caliber guy. If someone gets injured and you need him to come in and play for you, sure. If you want him to be your star special teams guy, I don't know. I mean, he can hit, he know somebody run the football, but you got to be able to cover a lot of ground in today's NFL. So I feel like that is Nate Landman is the guy that has essentially been played out. He played his time out with the Atlanta Falcons, just from a standpoint of you understand where you need to be from a talent level, at the linebacker spot, and he just doesn't fit that right now. And for him to not get that tender, I think it was on like $3 million. I mean, that's not a lot of money at all, especially a guy who started a lot of games for you. So for me, I feel like, the reason why they didn't bring him back was because they don't see him as a starting caliber linebacker. And they also might not see him as a guy that can be a star for them on special teams.
Mm-hmm. And what about for you, Free, when you think about them not tendering for the non-restricted free agent, Nate Landman, you think that's the right decision?
Yeah, I think so. I think Nate Landman was very valuable to the Falcons in 2023. Especially with them releasing Michael Walker, and you were like, I don't know about the depth of this position. Like, we had seen Michael Walker struggle as a starter, but at least that starting experience gave you trust and confidence that if someone got hurt and you need to insert somebody into the lineup, he was going to give you value. So they cut him in large part because of what they liked in Nate Landman. And so then when Trey Hendrickson goes down in week 3 of that 2023 season, you're like, what are the Falcons going to turn to? They turn to Nate Landman. He plays really well in that season. But the Falcons under Ryan Nielsen, the defensive coordinator back then, went out of their way to hide some of his limitations, that they would pull him off the field in third down situations, playing dime with 6 defensive backs to sort of replace that ability. And then this new regime comes in, and they're like, we're going to treat Nate Landman like a normal every down linebacker. And you saw, I think now those limitations get a little bit more exposed on the defensive side of the ball. And so because he doesn't have the same value as a depth piece at the linebacker position, because he probably doesn't have the same value and production on special teams as guys like J.D. Bertrand and Troy Anderson do, I do feel like he went from a guy that was maybe number 2 in the pecking order at the beginning of last season at the linebacker position to now he's potentially, especially if the Falcons bring in another linebacker this offseason, he could potentially be number 5 in that pecking order. And that's a big drop at this point in time. And, is that, your 5th best linebacker? Is that something that is that valuable for you to, go out of your way to retain by extending him that $3 million? I think the Falcons made the right choice in saying, like, that's not worth $3 million. Maybe we see him back at a cheaper deal, maybe for like a veteran minimum at like $1.2 million. That makes a little bit more sense for what you expect Nate Landman's role to be with this team moving forward.
And what about Dee Alford, JD? How do you feel about the Falcons making the decision not to tender him?
I thought it was kind of interesting. Yeah. And because when you think about like him, when he first came in, coming from CFL, small school, D2 guy, I have a little small place in my heart for those guys as well, for obvious reasons. And he comes in, plays well, right? And then he plays well enough to be penciled in as the starter coming into last year. And then you start to see that backside corner play a little bit better as well in Mike Hughes. And then, of course, you got AJ Terrell on the other side. So where are we going to go? We're going to find the weakness, and teams consistently did it throughout the year. That's why you saw 83 tackles, because they were going at him, of course. Yeah. At least tackle the man if they're going, you're going to continue to get beat. So I think you saw him get exposed a little bit, but that doesn't mean that he can't be a nice depth piece. And depth pieces don't make $3 million, right? You're not even worth that tag, right? For me. So I think that if you're asking me which one of these guys has the best opportunity to be in the Falcons uniform in 2025, it probably be Dee Alford. How about say D Gordon almost? How about that for a throwback?
Yeah, I think the difference between Dee Alford and Nate Landman is you had, as Jarvis said, you had like 2 years of good play from Dee Alford. That you can still, if you squint, really hard, you see a couple of those moments last season. It's just when you open your eyes a little bit more, you're seeing him fall over, not being able to find the football, getting completely turned around by Justin Jefferson. That image is burned into your brain. And so it's hard to get that image out of your head at this point in time, but I think you can make a case that Dee Alford has had more good moments than bad moments.
Yeah.
And so if you're looking to create some competition at that nickel cornerback spot, it does make sense to have a guy that you've seen do it for 3 years, even if it's been up and down in the room, just as at the very least as a measuring stick for, okay, if you can come in and outperform Dee Alford in camp, then you're good enough to be the starter. If you're not outperforming Dee Alford in camp, then you're not an option for us. So I think that's the main value that Dee Alford has at this point in time, just really camp competition. But because of that, that's not a priority re-sign at this stage if you believe that you can get a better option this offseason. And the Falcons should be able to get one.
And just in terms of releasing Dee Alford, releasing Nate Landman, do you guys feel like that does anything to give us some tea leaves or some tips on what the Falcons might do? I would say especially in the draft, but if you guys think it might give us some insight on free agency as well, let's talk about that. But first, do you think it gives us any insight on what they might do in the draft?
As far as restricted free agents goes, y'all know who's a restricted free agent? Ryan Newsel. So, might see something go around him in the next couple of days. You just never know. So, and that's the only thing that, those guys, like that, my mind started going to okay, there's another restricted free agent that you have on your roster that snaps left-handed and plays center. And so if the Chicago Bears are about to throw a back up the Brinks truck to Drew Dahlman, and Drew Dahlman saying, oh my gosh, I was willing to at least take a discount, but I can't turn down $14 million to go up to Chicago and snap for Caleb Williams. So that's the only thing for me that I started thinking about. Like, okay, as far as that group of guys, restricted free agents, you're not going to tend to those guys. What about Mr. Newsel? So yeah, that's something to keep an eye on as this legal tampering period opens up, and obviously when the new league year starts on Wednesday.
Yeah, that's a great call. That it might not so much tell us or give us any intel on what the Falcons might do with this draft class, especially as it relates to, do they go after, a linebacker, or do they go after a corner, but maybe, or win in the draft. Cause I hope it's not I hope it's a win in the draft they might go, or if they might go free agency, but does it give you any kind of tea leaves or breadcrumbs for what they might do with any of their other restricted sites, sort of like a Ryan Newsel?
Yeah, it is notable that they had like 6 restricted free agents. We already got updates on Alford, Landman, and Liam McCullough getting a contract extension.
Yes.
Still no word on what happens with Harrison Hand, although we could probably guess the cornerback that most people are like, who? So we can probably guess what's going to happen with him. Sure. Kyle Hinton, the backup guard, and then Ryan Newsel. So Newsel's the main one that we'll be paying most attention to because of what Jarvis is saying with Drew Dahlman. But I think, for me at least, with Alford and Landman being unrestricted free agents and so having the ability to test the market, it does suggest to me that maybe the Falcons are not going to wait till the draft to try to find the linebacker and nickel cornerback spot, just because if that was the case, you would think maybe they'd be a little bit more willing to keep those guys around as placeholders until the draft, just to know that, okay, we know we have this guy in the building, and then if we get to the draft, we can find that upgrade, then we'll find that we'll get that upgrade. But if not, we at least still have this guy. It makes me think that maybe we'll see the Falcons address both of these positions at nickel cornerback and linebacker in March before we get to April at this point in time. But at the same time, they should be able to, whether they attack it at March or wait till April, they should be able to find better options at both of those spots this offseason.
Okay, I am going to make you guys throw me something in 60 seconds because now there's multiple reports that are buzzing and saying that the Falcons are in the mix for one Hassan Reddick. Thoughts?
Well,
You gonna play football this year?
he has proved that he can get to the quarterback. You know, he's a name that the Falcons have been interested in the past. And I just saw something interesting that I was looking at before the show. You know, all those guys we were lusting over at the trade deadline, all of them mofos are looking for new teams. So I just leave it at that.
Exactly. That's the tea that Jarvis wanted to spill before we wrap up. Thanks to our everydayers for making the Atlanta Football Party your first listen of the day. Be sure to stop by Locked On Falcons with Aaron and his frequent guest analyst Jarvis as your second listen. And check out some of Tori's work at AtlantaFalcons.com. Like we said, she is busy for obvious reasons up in Flowery Branch right now. She'll be back with us next week. We will see you next time.